Hello and welcome. This is Barrett from Cypress College, and in this video today, we're going to talk about AWS IAM. So this is kind of a lab walkthrough based on the AWS Academy Cloud Foundations course. And as you can see here, we have loaded up the introduction to AWS IAM. So IAM meaning Identity and Access Management. We're going to be taking a look at different users and groups and security credentials such as access keys and permissions that can control different AWS resources that these users can access. So if you look at this kind of diagram here, you see we're going to be working with 3 different users that are already created. We have 3 different groups that have also already been created, and then different types of policies that are going to allow different types of access when added to these groups. And then specific users will be assigned to specific groups. So we're going to see how, depending on which group you're assigned to, and also which policy, which IAM policy is attached to those groups, you will see how that determines what type of access you have to which types of resources. So essentially, what I'm looking at right here, if you are taking CIS 257 at Cypress College, you will become familiar with this kind of lab that's done within the AWS Academy Canvas course. So you have all of these lab walkthroughs here. I'm going to pull this over to the side and just let the video focus solely on the management console and the work that we're doing. But just remember that you do have this walkthrough available to you. And essentially, when you start these labs, remember, you just click Start Lab. Usually takes no longer than 5 minutes for everything to be provisioning. And this is all kind of done with AWS CloudFormation, which is a type of infrastructure configuration and automation that you will learn as the weeks go by. But essentially, it starts up the lab. Once it says is ready and okay, you just click this AWS button, and then that is what launches the AWS Management Console. And you'll see that you get logged in under your name as it's registered to the AWS Academy. But essentially, this is not tied to you specifically, especially not in terms of like your credit card or anything. This is like a sandbox environment. So you're kind of free to play around, to mess around, and to have fun with it. But essentially, we do want to follow along with the lab, especially in your first time working with these different AWS services. So let's take a look at the management console. There's different ways that you could access these different tools or services, I should say. Straight off the bat, you could see recently visited services. And if you very commonly go to, see IAM is over here. If you access IAM a lot, you may see it right up front here. So this is one area that you may get used to choosing regular services that you access frequently. You could also go up to services here, and IAM is going to be, sometimes it's hard to find because there's so many services, but under security, identity, and compliance, we have IAM here. So that is a second way. And then finally, you can always just do a search up here, and you will see IAM manage access to AWS resources. So let's go ahead and visit IAM and see what's going on here. All right, so one big thing that you'll learn about IAM and security best practices, this isn't really a part of this lab, but thought I would call it out, is there's generally checklists when not only when you first set up an account. Imagine you create your own account today. That would be a root account, and it's general best practice to delete the access keys for that root account, make sure MFA or multi-factor authentication is enabled. And then what you do is you create an administrator IAM user, and then you grant them full administrative access. So they essentially have mostly the same access as root, but root, if somebody gets access to your root account, it's all over, right? But if somebody gets access to your administrative account, you could still log into that root account and do some incident response and delete the administrator account or change the password, things like that. But also here, it's just good for you to review overall general best practices for IAM management. So grant least privilege access. You don't want people having access to services that they don't need, right? Use AWS organizations. This is really good if you have multiple accounts and you want to link them all together. MFA, very, very important. In case somebody does get your password and it's compromised, at least you have that second layer of defense, right? But anyways, I digress. Let's go ahead and hop into the lab objectives. So first thing we could do, let's see what kind of users we have. So we'll click on users, and we see we have the user 1, 2, and 3. We also have AWS student. But these three right here are the ones that we're going to be working with for this lab. Okay, and now we can go over to user groups. And you'll notice that these are the same user groups that we saw in that opening diagram. So we have EC2 admin, EC2 support, S3 support. So EC2 is essentially Elastic Compute Cloud. This is your VMs, your virtual machines that you spin up, the infrastructure as a service where you can install databases if you want to. You can install web servers on these EC2 instances. And then S3 is object level storage. So these are your buckets used to store all kinds of things. And you could also even run static websites on S3 buckets. They're often used for log storage, things like that. And that's something we're going to talk about in upcoming weeks. So now we've explored the users, we've explored the groups. Let's take a look at one particular group. So we're going to go to EC2-support. And if we go to permissions, we can see what this group, a policy that is attached to this. So it has a managed policy. This is AWS managed, meaning it is built into AWS. It was created by AWS. As customers, we are able to create our own customer managed policies that can be very specific. But in this case, this is just granting this group Amazon EC2 read-only access. So as you can imagine, and here is the JSON JavaScript object notation of that policy. And you could basically see it's allowing you to describe an EC2. It's allowing to describe any kind of elastic load balancing that's involved with that. You could list CloudWatch metrics. And don't worry, a lot of these things will start to make sense as you go on in this course and understand what CloudWatch is, what elastic load balancing is, and how it relates to an EC2, right? But main thing you need to know is in the EC2 support group, this policy is attached, meaning anybody added to this group is going to have read-only access for EC2. And so let's go ahead and check out the other groups here. So if we go to S3 support, let's have a look at the permissions here. And you can see we have Amazon S3 read-only access. So that makes sense. And once again, you could take a look at the JSON for the policy. It's very simple. It's just allowing you to get and list S3 contents. All right. And now finally, if we go back to user groups, take a look at EC2 admin, have a look at the permissions, the EC2 admin policy is added. So we're going to see a lot more additional to this, which they'll be able to start and stop instances. They can actually administer, the provisioning of EC2 instances or potentially stopping them if needed. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the business scenario that the lab discusses. So your company is growing its use of AWS. It's using many EC2 instances and a great deal of Amazon S3 storage. You wish to give access to new staff depending upon their job function. So user one, they need to be a part of the S3 support group because they need read-only access to Amazon S3. User two, they need EC2 support, read-only access to EC2. And then user three, that's going to be an EC2 administrator. So they will need to be added to the EC2 admin group. So let's go back to the main user groups. And we could start with S3 support. So we can click on that and it's fairly simple. So right now we're on the users tab here. We're just going to go and click add users here and we can add user one. And simple enough, they are added in there. So now let's go ahead and do similar for the EC2 support group. And this is going to be, we're going to add user two to this group. And we'll go back to user groups, EC2-admin. Let's go ahead and add user three. And actually, you know what? I'm going to show you a different way. So we could just add them here, but if you're ever in the user section, you could also potentially click on the user three, go to groups, add user to groups, and then we're adding them to EC2-admin. So there's, two different ways that you could do that, either if you're in the users area or the user groups area. It would obviously make sense to add from here if you knew that you needed to add multiple users to one group, but just figured I would show you that other way. So we have these users assigned to the different groups. Now let's log in as each of these and just double check and verify and see what happens when we try to access certain resources. So we'll need to open up a new private window. And let's go back to, okay, so in the management console, no matter where you're at, just click dashboard. And what we want to do, we want to copy this sign-in URL. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come back over to my private window, because remember, you want to make sure you open up a new private browser because we're currently logged in here. So we want to create that new private window, which is here, so that we could log in fresh as a completely different user. And so it will fill out the account ID. So let's first sign in as user-1. And the password is lab-password1. And remember, this information is going to be in your lab walkthrough. Okay, so we're signing in as user-1. Okay, so this is, you can notice up here, we see user-1. If I move over to my other tab, I'm still logged in as the other main account. And as a reminder, user-1 is a part of the S3 support. And this is kind of interesting here. You see last activity now. because we just logged in as that user. So imagine this account here is kind of like an administrator account, and they can see certain activity from other users. Okay, so back to user-1. Let's see, do we have access to EC2? And you see a whole bunch of API errors, meaning that we just don't have access to these things. So if I try to go to instances, you are not authorized to perform this operation, launch instances, and if I try to select, it's going to say an error has occurred, right? So, but if I take us over to S3, remember we have read-only access for S3, and looks like there is a bucket that's already created here called sample bucket. There's currently no objects, but I'm able to read that. Now I probably wouldn't be able to write to it, but I can read it. Okay, so now let's go ahead and sign out of user-1. And I'm going to copy and paste that sign in URL again. If you happen to have lost it from your clipboard, remember you can come back to the main account and go to dashboard. You have that console login right here. Okay. And by the way, I'm on Windows, and all I'm doing is pressing Alt and Tab to switch between my windows. So if anybody's wondering how I'm doing that. Okay, so back in the private browser, let's go ahead and sign in as user-2. And the password is lab-password2. And let's remember user-2, this is the EC2- support group. So if we go to S3, we shouldn't have access. So you see it was trying to load buckets, but we don't have permission for that. And if we go to EC2, remember EC2 is basically virtual machines. These are instances that you can use to host web servers, database servers, all kinds of servers. So you see, because we have read access for instances, we see that there are 2 here. Now, if I wanted to try and start an instance, we're probably going to get a warning. Let's double check. Yeah, EC2 support shouldn't be able to. Let's say proceed without. Yeah, there we go. So it almost seemed like we were going to be able to launch that, but in the end, we are not authorized to. Remember, there's that that attribute in the JSON policy of start instance, start and stop the instance. So we don't have that ability here. Okay, and let me go ahead and sign out. And finally, we are going to sign back in as user-3. And this is where lab-password3, this is where we're going to have administrative rights for EC2. But once again, we could verify. We shouldn't have access to S3 here. Because remember, user-3, EC2 admin. Yep, don't have permissions to list buckets. But if we come over to EC2, we'll click on instances here on the left side. And don't worry, we're going to be going over a lot more on all these other services and other labs. But this is cool because anytime you're in these sandbox environments, you can kind of mess around and get familiar with a lot of the the service options. But here you could see, ignore the alarm status. That's okay. But let's see. In fact, I don't know if we'll actually even be able to launch an instance. We'll be doing that in another lab. But ideally, what we want to see is if we can stop. So these are both currently running. And I believe the lab would like us to attempt to stop the lab host. So we'll click that. We'll go to instance state, stop instance. And you can see successfully stopped. You could refresh right here. And you will notice that it's in a current stopping state. And it usually takes just a minute or two. Just a minute or two. But and while that's going, down here is very useful. So whenever you are selected on an EC2 instance, you get a lot of details down here. The public DNS, private IP address, public IP address. So this could have been maybe a public website, web server, for example. And then under security, this is something we will definitely touch on. Very important is security groups. And in this case, I'll just go ahead and point out, this is very bad security practice to have port 22, which is SSH, secure shell. This is how you remotely connect to a Linux box. But having this quad zeros as a source basically is allowing any external internet source to attempt to connect via SSH port 22. So, I mean, obviously they would need to know the password, but you definitely don't want somebody to even be able to attempt to brute force your server, whatever it may be. So this is actually very bad practice to have this set to quad zeros. What you want to do is actually set it to precisely the IP address that you know will be connecting to administer, a Linux box. So, but anyways, I digress, going a little bit far beyond this lab, but I just thought I would mention it. And if we refresh again, we could see that this has completely stopped. So that looks like that concludes this lab. That's essentially all that this is meant to cover. So just to recap, I'll pull this back over, and just to look at this diagram again. Remember, we had 3 users created. We had 3 different groups that allowed different types of access based on the IAM policy that was attached to the group. So the EC2 admin policy allowed us to, view all the running instances, but also start and stop them, which we just saw on that last one. And we attached user 3 to EC2 admin. EC2 support, this only allowed us to read and to potentially connect to those EC2 instances, and that we attached user 2 to EC2 support. And then finally, S3 support, we were given read-only access to S3 buckets, and we attached user 1 to the S3 support group, giving that user specific access to the S3 bucket. All right, well, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.